The topic of Christianity in Japan is very fascinating, to say the least. It's hard for me to think of a country that's had such a mixed relationship, going from kind of idealization to deep hatred, from it becoming a very powerful social force to being one of the few countries on earth that kind of successfully exterminated its Christian population and successfully completely drove it underground for an extended period of time. At one point, Japan was rapidly converting to Christianity, but after the Tokugawa's purges, it went underground, and while Christianity was legalized during the Meiji Restoration, it just kind of never took off. I think only about 1% of Japan's population is Christian, but if you've ever seen any Japanese manga or anime, Christian symbolism is very common within it. And that's because Japan kind of has a very love hate relationship with the West, where it goes through periods of wanting to westernize, wanting to be modern, and take everything that comes with it, and then periods of more kind of xenophobic exceptionalism, where Japan views the West as a corrupting and evil influence. And Japan really goes back and forth on this issue, and kind of how Christianity is viewed, whether or not the public converts to it in any significant numbers, I think really changes throughout the time period. So when I do history, what I like to do is step a bit outside of my perspective. So obviously, as a Christian Westerner, my sympathies naturally lie with Japanese Christians and with, I guess, kind of condemning Hideyoshi and the Tokugawa shogunate and the repression of Christianity, and like saying it's demonic and it's evil and it prevented the conversion and salvation of Japan. And that's all probably true to a certain extent, but I kind of like to look at it from the other perspective. Was the decision to outlaw and brutally repress Christianity just a xenophobic backlash on the part of the Tokugawa shogunate? Was it that they were possessed by demons or whatever? Or was it a rational, realpolitik decision? And this is always interesting. This is kind of the other side of history. Probably the best example of this is the idea that Hitler was insane by meddling with the invasion of Russia because he wanted to go to the Caucasus and attack Baku rather than go to Moscow. And a lot of people just view this as insanity. But in that case, there was a very rational reason for that, because if they had have taken Baku or Stalingrad, they could have cut off Russia's oil supplies and maybe caused the Russian economy to completely collapse. And in this case, I just kind of wanted to talk about the context under which the Tokugawa basically wiped out Christianity, and why, in my view, I think it did make a lot of rational sense, even if it was an evil action. Now, during and in the aftermath of Sengoku Judai, if I'm pronouncing it properly, or the Warring States era, Japan was actually quite rapidly Christianizing. I think there was as many as like 100,000 Christians at one point. A number of daimyo had converted. It was spreading pretty rapidly. From my understanding, a big part of that was this is around the time the Portuguese colonial empire really started to take off. They had their distant East Indian trade routes, and they started to come in contact with Japan because Japan produced a lot of goods that were very valuable in Europe. And as kind of a more formal civilization, it was probably a lot easier to trade with the Japanese than some of probably the more less developed, less urban tribes that you get throughout the Southeast Asia. Also, as it was the Warring States era, different groups were looking for any advantage they could get. And it's kind of interesting. You get this idea if you watch something like The Last Samurai, which is not completely inaccurate, but is inaccurate. What actually happened during the Satsuma Rebellion, if memory serves, was they were using guns until they ran out of gunpowder, and then they resorted to like using swords and bows and arrows again. But they would have used guns if they had them. And that's kind of what happened with the samurai. The first time they saw guns, they're like, these are the coolest things we've ever seen. We need to get as many as possible. So they started importing matchlocks at a crazy pace, and they quickly figured out how to make them. So within a couple decades during the invasion of Korea, the Japanese army had huge numbers of matchlocks that they used to devastating effect. So what I'm saying is the Japanese have always been very eager to adopt technology, particularly military technology. And since they were so obsessed with importing all these matchlocks, the Portuguese got a lot of influence and they were able to spread Christianity. That being said, let's just take a step back and let's look at what Japan was like in a religious sense prior to the end of the Warring States period with Oda Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and later Ieyasu. Now, we've talked about this in the past, but Pure Land Buddhism has always kind of been a big thing in Japan since the introduction of Pure Land Buddhism. On the surface, at least, Pure Land Buddhism has a lot of similarities to Christianity, particularly, I guess you could say, Protestantism. Because the idea is, it depends on your type of Pure Land Buddhism, but I believe it's Amada Buddha. And the idea is, so long as you believe in Amada Buddha, and you die in belief of him, preferably while saying his mantra, Amada Buddha has a field of infinite karma, and he has like a pocket dimension, and when you die, you go there, and you aren't reincarnated. He just keeps you there. It kind of gives his karma that he's accumulated to you, I guess a bit like grace, and you stay there until you become a Buddha yourself, and you're freed, and you've achieved nirvana. And this was open to everybody because all that was really required was faith and praying to Amada Buddha and that kind of thing. So it was immensely popular among the peasantry, prostitutes, criminals, ronin, all kinds of the social outcasts of Japanese society. This took off very rapidly. And because it was very doctrinally simple, it kind of spread like wildfire. And another thing to keep in mind is kind of the social structure of Japan at the time. You had obviously the daimyo, then you had the samurai, and then you had everybody else. And Japan had a relatively large percentage of the population that were samurai. It's a bit like what happened in Spain. I think it was like 5 to 10%. And eventually during the Edo period, they would kind of become welfare queens. But you had this large upper class that the peasantry had to support. And with the constant warfare, etc., more and more people kind of started to turn to religion. And then you got the Iko-Iki, which was kind of the culmination of the Pure Land Buddhist movement. I'm greatly simplifying all of this. But they actually started to set up their own states. They had like fortress monasteries. They started conquering land. They started to create their own feudal theocracy throughout the country. And they would frequently get into fights with the various daimyo. And they were constantly kind of a thorn in the side, particularly of Oda Nobunaga. And they would intervene a whole bunch during the Warring States era. And they were able to field armies as big as any of the daimyo. And kind of unlike the other daimyo, they represented a fundamental threat to Japan's structure. Whereas it didn't matter to a certain extent in terms of feudalism in Japan which family ruled, which family was shogun. The general privileges of the class would probably stay similar. If the Iko-Iki had ever really kind of broken out, they might have completely changed the Japanese system. In particular, the theocracies they set up, to my understanding, were the first time in Japanese history where commoners had governed lands. And the repeated uprisings and battles they had against Nobunaga and kind of the other daimyo devastated large portions of Japan and led to a large number of deaths. So when you get into kind of the end of the Warring States era, there's this very strong sense of anti-clericalism. The daimyo want to protect their position, but they also kind of want to end the constant civil conflict. So Nobunaga, and in particular Hideyoshi, did very harsh crackdowns on the Iko-Iki and Buddhism in general, and kind of eventually brought it to heel. But the Iko-Iki and kind of the various Pure Land militant movements had been going on for, I think, about 100 years at this point in time. So there was this great fear on the part of the Japanese upper class of these mass religious movements coming about, in particular ones that appealed to the lower class. But the other fear is obviously that if daimyos start to convert, then they might form some sort of league against the central government, and they're able to levy these huge numbers of commoners, and it's a real kind of existential threat. So that's kind of part one. There was an environment in Japan that was very anti-clerical, to say the least, and kind of anti-mass religious movement in kind of a broader sense. And once again, this is not an irrational position to take. This is learning the lessons of the last 100 years, and this is real. This isn't just like the Japanese, I guess, fedora spinning or whatever. They had a very real fear of this kind of movement. So that's part one. Part two, we have the association of Christianity with Europeans. Now, it's often been considered within the third world, and it kind of goes back and forth whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but that Christianity is fundamentally Western or fundamentally European and kind of fundamentally the daughter colonies of Europe. And in almost all cases, particularly prior to modern day, the spread of Christianity has been accompanied by the adoption of Western culture. Generally speaking, missionaries have promoted that too, and they've kind of encouraged, I don't know if modernization is the right term, but getting rid of a lot of kind of the local traditions, adopting kind of Western clothing, Western legal codes, that sort of thing. And it has been very much used as a tool of colonial empires. Like, it was very common, I believe this is what happened in Madagascar, Indochina, but just in a lot of parts of Africa, is missionaries would arrive from the French or the Dutch or the Spanish or whoever. They'd start converting the local population, and then if there was any kind of crackdown or backsliding, they would invade and make it a colony under the pretext of protecting the local Christian population. And this was also something Rome would do within Persia. And to my understanding, that's how the Nestorian Church was founded, because the Persians were justifiably concerned that they had this large Christian population on the border who were subservient, at least spiritually, to the Pope in Rome, who obviously they saw as an extension of the Roman Empire. So the Japanese government saw Christianity as being a political threat to Japan's independence. They saw that the Europeans were creating this increasingly large proportion of the Japanese population that identified more with Europe than necessarily with other Japanese Buddhists. And this scared them, and they had kind of seen the various examples of what had happened throughout the world of various countries that had become colonies. Now, once again, you can view this as a good thing or a bad thing. You can say, as I would probably say, that Christ saves, and it's probably more important to convert than to worry as much about independence. You can make that argument, but you can make the argument in the other way. My point being that this was a rational concern. This was based on empirical data. This was based on things that were happening. And particularly when daimyo started to convert, I mean, even if a majority of Japan wouldn't have become Christian, even if it had been a relatively small part, an area like some of the islands might have become Christian, and the daimyo might have converted in those cases, and you might have had certain daimyo that became pro-European, and the Europeans would be funding them with tertios, mercenary troops, just giving them guns and money and stuff like that. And you might have had them be able to basically de facto break up Japan and greatly weaken the authority of the central government. Japan is impossible, or at least was impossible, to colonize in a traditional sense because it was the population of France and it had more guns than Western Europe, I believe, at the time. So they couldn't formally militarily take it over, but they could break it up into various kind of satellite states that were individually weak enough to be culturally and economically and politically dominated by Europe. So what I'm saying is I think there was this very rational concern. They kind of read the writing on the wall. They saw this had happened in a lot of other places, and that this was basically an extension in a way of the Portuguese and Spanish and Dutch or whoever of trying to get direct influence over Japan. Now, the next point is something I've heard debate about. Some people have told me that the church in Japan refused to ordain native Japanese. And other people have said they just didn't ordain very many. But the general agreement I've seen is that the vast majority of the clergy were Europeans. So once again, you have all these foreigners coming in and becoming your priesthood. I guess it's to a certain extent, you can kind of see it like how Saudi Arabia sends all the radical imams around the world and stirs up stuff there and kind of undermines the local government. So this was kind of the situation, I guess, kind of in summary, that Hideyoshi and the Tokugawa were facing. Okay, trade with Europe was still nice, and they did certainly continue it, but they didn't really need guns anymore, at least not in the same numbers. After Sengoku Jidai finished, they were like, all we care about at this point is stability. We don't want another Warring States period. We want the shogunate to be established and have a couple centuries of peace to rebuild after this disaster. We're still cleaning up the Ikoiki. We don't want the Europeans to come in and start another civil war, this time over religion. So the safest thing to do is just to exterminate Christianity and drive it underground. And to be kind of fair to the Tokugawa, you can't really argue with results. Japan had a couple centuries of peace and prosperity. Just kind of a side note, it's kind of overstated how isolated Japan was during this period. As I like to put it, there was no foreign trade allowed except for the foreign trade that was allowed. What kind of had happened is, to a certain extent, the whole isolation of Japan and the closing it off was kind of a meme, and it was just so the Tokugawa could limit trade to certain ports controlled by themselves, and they could make all the money off of it. It was largely just kind of centralized international trade, so it just benefited them personally. But the Tokugawa were always very keen to keep it abreast of what was happening abroad, and to keep carrying out profitable trade deals. So it was kind of a period of isolation, but it was also a period of stability and great economic growth within the country. So those are kind of my thoughts on the matter. Once again, I'm not defending the extermination of Japanese Christians on moral grounds, but it's interesting to look at it from the other perspective and go, were they crazy? Were they evil? Or was there some rational Realpolitik involved within this? So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you maybe learned something. God bless, of course, and I will talk to everybody again real soon.